Hi, students. Sorry about that. I accidentally stopped the recording. So rather than redo the prior recording, this is now part two of the same series of slides, continuing from part one. So this is slide 8 of 14. So this was a slide I stopped at, so we would continue right from here. So here's the trachea again, leading into the branches of the right and left primary bronchi. And so each bronchus, singular, will divide further into smaller and smaller airways, ending in bronchioles. Bronchioles within the lungs are kept open not by cartilage, but by smooth muscle and elastic fibers. And I think I explained this in the last narration. So now we can move on to this slide. We sort of went through this also already. So what we want to look at on this other image here is we're actually looking at the interaction at this level here with the smallest branches and when they terminate or meet with the alveoli. So this thing looking like a bunch of grapes, this is called an alveolar sac. It's called an alveolar sac because each one of those little bubbles, what looks like a little bubble, each one of those like would be like a grape, that's an alveolus. Alveoli is plural, or alveoli, that would be plural. So this is not the trachea, this structure here. This is a terminal bronchiole. So the branching leads to something called a terminal bronchiole, and terminal, you know, is kind of at the end, right? The bus terminus is where all the buses kind of end their journey at the end of the day. So the terminal bronchiole leads to respiratory bronchioles, which are just smaller, again, smaller passageways heading into the alveoli. So after the respiratory bronchiole, there is, so let's label the terminal bronchiole, let's call it number 1. Then there's respiratory bronchiole number 2. There's an alveolar duct, which is a passageway again. And that is what leads into the alveolar sac. We can also see blood vessels now. So we have here in red, obviously red representing oxygenated blood. And we know that oxygenated blood from the lungs is carried by the pulmonary vein back to the heart, back to the left atrium. So you do need to make this connection between the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system. Here in blue is deoxygenated blood, and of course that is transported by the pulmonary artery. So deoxygenated blood comes to the lungs because it's carrying lots of carbon dioxide. And this, the pulmonary vein, so I should put the arrow going the other way because that is taking blood away from the lungs to go back to the heart. So gas exchange only occurs in the alveoli. And the smooth muscle, which you can actually see here, see these bands? That's smooth muscle. That is what helps to keep the bronchioles open. So anyone who has asthma probably would be very familiar with the fact that one of their treatments is something called a bronchodilator, because asthma is caused by an inflammatory response to the bronchioles, the airways. Usually the trigger could be something like pollen or dust, a virus, etc. But what it causes, the inflammatory response also causes a lot of mucus to build up in these airways, and mucus blocks the passage of air. But the other thing is these smooth muscles also constrict, they contract, and they do not relax easily. So the bronchodilator helps to get the muscles to relax so that the air can flow through. One of the other treatments is to give the patient a corticosteroid, which is a drug that dampens down the immune response, because the immune response is what's driving the inflammatory response. You can appreciate that because we've already studied the lymphatic and immune system. So in this case, in this scenario, this is occurring in the bronchioles mostly. Now here again is the same image from the last slide, but instead the focus is going to be on one of these alveolus. So here's the one alveolus. So each alveolus is connected to the other one by these pores. And what I would like you to appreciate is the alveolus is where the gas exchange occurs. Gas exchange occurs by diffusion. Diffusion is most efficient if gases need to pass through a very thin barrier or a thin membrane. So we have what is called a respiratory membrane that is made up of the blood capillary membrane. Remember, capillaries are also one cell layer thick. They're made up of simple squamous epithelium, and the alveolus is also one cell layer thick, and it's made up of simple squamous epithelium. So that's the thinnest cell that we have in the body, but those two have to basically form the membrane to allow for the gas exchange. The other thing to notice, so you see the alveolus as a gas-filled space, is macrophages. So these are from, again, the immune system, and they tend to clean up any debris that might be around. Unfortunately, if you smoke again, a lot of the tar from the cigarette ends up basically being stuck. Just because you're a macrophage doesn't mean that you can clean up every possible type of debris. So the red that's being shown here, that's the capillary. That's a blood capillary. So the blood capillary are very sort of thick, covering up all the alveoli because the exchange has to be very efficient. The blood is still flowing. The blood doesn't slow down just because it needs to be have gases removed and exchanged and so forth. Blood flow is continuing as normal. So in a capillary, yes, the pressure is lower, the flow rate is slower, but the exchange needs to happen. So it needs to be very efficient. On this side, what we're seeing here is this is the lumen of the bronchiole. We can see some blood vessels being shown. So this is a photomicrograph of basically lung tissue. And so the alveoli are shown. This would be, for example, that would represent one alveolus. This is the alveolar duct that leads to the alveolar sac. Now, the alveolus is responsible for gas exchange. Each alveolus, each alveoli air sac, is surrounded by microscopic blood capillaries containing blood that has arrived from the heart by the pulmonary artery. Remember, this blood is low in oxygen but high in carbon dioxide. So this gas exchange that is occurring here in the lungs is what we call external respiration. So we use this word respiration in 3 different contexts when we're learning anatomy and physiology. We talk about cellular respiration, which is the combustion of glucose that occurs in the mitochondria. Then we talk about internal respiration, which is the gas exchange that occurs between blood and tissues of organs in the body. And we talk about external respiration. So external respiration is the one that's occurring here. You might remember it because the lungs has it has a function with the external air. So maybe that might help you to remember that what happens in the lungs is external respiration, right? We breathe out oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide, we breathe in oxygen. So Respiration is not, technically speaking, breathing. Breathing is ventilation. So the gas exchange that's occurring here, this is external respiration, external, EXT, this is gas exchange. So there's two gas exchanges occurring like you learned in the cardiovascular system. This is nothing new. All we're doing here is attaching a label to the gas exchange. We're calling it external respiration. But in the cardiovascular system, all you learned was the pulmonary artery takes deoxygenated blood to the lungs. At the lungs, the blood becomes oxygenated and it comes back via the pulmonary veins to the heart. That's what you learned. In this, for this topic, the pulmonary respiratory system, for this topic, we're just going into a little bit more detail for the gas exchange part and making sure that we understand exactly which gas is leaving blood, which gas is entering blood, which gas is leaving the alveoli of the lung, which gas is entering the alveoli of the lung. Okay. So when we think of the lungs and their position in the thoracic cavity, we need to talk about something called the pleura. The pleura is a membrane. It's a sac that surrounds the lung. So just as how the heart had a pericardium, which is a sac basically surrounding the heart, the lung has a pleura membrane. And this membrane has a bit of fluid so that it keeps the lung moist and lubricated. It also means that as the lung expands and collapses, you know, with breathing, that there is less friction. So in terms of the mechanics of breathing, the diaphragm does most of the work. Typically, if I were to draw sort of the body here, oftentimes we'll see the diaphragm shown like that. This is referred to as dome-shaped. Now, when we are about to inhale, which is also called inspiration, the diaphragm moves downwards. And when it moves downwards, it becomes flat. The ribs, which are shown over here with their intercostal muscles, the rib cage is moved by the intercostal muscles. The rib cage moves up and out. So what ends up happening is the total volume, look at the distance now, right? So the diaphragm was here, now it's moved all the way down here. So we have greater volume, both this way in length and in width, because the ribs move up and out. That is for inspiration, inhalation. When that happens, the volume of the thoracic cavity, or the volume of the lungs, increases. Volume increases. Air always moves from high pressure to low pressure. Now, when we're standing or sitting or wherever we are, there's air pressure on us. So there we are. The air pressure is 1 atmosphere. There are different units for pressure. Atmosphere is 1, which is the same as 760 millimeters mercury. But that is pressure exerted on us. And air always moves from high pressure to low pressure. So when the volume in the thoracic cavity has increased, the pressure in the thoracic cavity has decreased. This here is referred to as, you know, an example of Boyle's law. So in the next slide, I'll talk about Boyle's law. But that's what it's important to remember. The volume of the thoracic cavity or the volume of the lungs increases for inspiration. At the same time, the pressure in the lungs decreases. Air moves from high pressure to low pressure, so with the pressure being low, this is now low pressure because the pressure has decreased. Air moves in. So this is where we see air will flow in. So do not think that air is sucked into the lungs, or something is pushing the air into the lungs. No, it flows because of a gradient, high to low pressure. Same as blood. Blood flows from high to low pressure. So it's a gradient, high to low. The air moves in. Once the air moves in, then I'm going to clean up this right now. So just give me a minute to erase that. Okay. One more. Now, on this slide here, we see the terms inspiration and expiration to represent inhalation and exhalation. So in inspiration, what we have is the diaphragm moves downwards. It contracts, but it moves downwards. It is flat. It is not dome-shaped. The external intercostal muscles contract and move the rib cage up and out. And so the thoracic cavity expands. It increases in volume. Volume increases. And at the same time, the pressure decreases. So you're probably wondering why the pressure decreases, but I'll show you in the next slide. Now, as the air is coming in and filling up the lungs, the pressure inside the lungs is now going to increase because you have more air molecules present in the lungs. So there gets to a point where that pressure is slightly above atmospheric pressure outside here. And once that happens, remember, air moves from high pressure to low pressure. So air will start to flow back out. So inspiration is an active process. You have to make it happen. So that's active. But expiration is a passive process. It will happen because, remember, all these muscles are contracted. The diaphragm is contracted. The external intercostal muscles are also contracted. And when muscles are contracting, they use up a lot of ATP and they can't stay contracted all the time. They will fatigue. These are skeletal muscles. So the slight high pressure means that the diaphragm starts to relax and go back to its dome shape. And the external intercostal muscles, they start to relax, and the rib cage comes down and comes inwards. So from the dotted line to this shape here. And that would be expiration. So let's try and understand now Boyle's law. So Boyle was a scientist who was interested in how gases behave. And when we think of gases, we think of 4 properties. The pressure of a gas, the volume of the gas, something called the number of moles of the gas, and the temperature of the gas. We're not going to worry about the other 2. We're only going to look at pressure and volume because that's what Boyle's law is about. There are other gas laws which you might have learned in chemistry, Charles's law, Dalton's law of partial pressure, and so forth. So all of those scientists were curious back in the day about how gases behave. So here's a sort of experiment that Boyle did. So we have a container, and we often think of the volume of a gas as the volume of the container. And these, of course, are the gas molecules. They move around, they bounce against the walls of the container, they bounce against each other. That is the force that's being exerted on the walls of the container. That force is what is measured as the pressure of a gas. Now, you can take a balloon, you can blow it up, and you can blow it up until it bursts. So what has happened there? You have put so much air molecules into the balloon that at a certain point, the force of those air molecules was greater than what the walls of the balloon could take, and so the balloon just burst. So the volume is whatever size the container is. So let's say the volume of this one is 4 liters. The pressure is what's being exerted on the walls of the container. So let's say the pressure is 2 atm. What happens if we press this plunger down? So if we do that, we are decreasing the volume. So let's say we have the volume. We have the volume now to 2 liters. What happens to the pressure? Well, we have the volume. We didn't remove any gas. We've got the same amount of gas particles present in there and here. But now the gas particles have a smaller area to move around in. They hit the walls of the container far more frequently. They hit each other far more frequently. So the pressure, because they're hitting the walls of the container more frequently, the pressure will increase. So whenever the volume of a gas decreases, the pressure increases, and vice versa. This is what BIOL discovered. So that's what Boyle's law says. So the volume of a gas is inversely proportional to the pressure of a gas. And I would hope that you have actually learned enough chemistry to appreciate this. So this is our explanation for, in the previous slides, what I was talking about the volume and the pressure in the lungs. Now, a connection in terms of how breathing is regulated, you probably remember from our study of the nervous system that we had 2 structures in the brainstem, the pons and the medulla oblongata. And these have centers, special sort of nervous system structures that help to control our rate of breathing. So what they do is they send nerve impulses along the spinal cord and spinal nerves to the intercostal muscles and to the diaphragm to help regulate breathing. But what this means is that if you injure, the cervical vertebrae, the spine, that could cause problems for breathing too. The medulla responds to a rise in carbon dioxide levels, and that will help to increase breathing rate because carbon dioxide is toxic to cells. That's why cells, even though they're carrying out cellular respiration and producing ATP and at the same time producing carbon dioxide, they need to get rid of it. So the carbon dioxide is transported by blood. That is what the deoxygenated blood, that all the veins, except the pulmonary vein, all the veins collect the oxygenated blood, bring it back to their right atrium, goes into the right ventricle, and then the pulmonary artery takes it to the heart. So carbon dioxide is also the reason that you can't hold your breath forever and ever and ever. Because when you hold your breath, that rise in carbon dioxide that's in the body, that is sensed by what are called chemoreceptors. So they're receptors that detect carbon dioxide in the body has risen to beyond the normal level, and therefore this person needs to breathe. So all of that information, eventually is sent and controlled by the pons and the medulla oblongata. They both have a role to play in helping to regulate breathing. So this is the last slide for the part 1. So this is part 2, I suppose, is what we will call of the first narration. And I apologize. Actually, I had a respiratory system problem. I needed to sneeze, and instead of hitting the pause button, I actually hit the finish recording button. So that's why you've ended up with two narrations. Okay, that's it for this part, and I'll see you for the second part that deals with the physiology